to now bring Maeve Magner to the stage. Maeve, if you can come up and have a seat. You know, in the design of the program, what I'm trying to do is to really bring people with different ideas to the stage. And Maeve has been working with nonprofits, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the Clinton Foundation, in Africa and other continents. So Maeve, what I want to do is have you tell the group a little bit about your work and what brings you here today and, you know, what you've seen in supply chain in those situations.
Sure. Let me give you just a quick background for perspective. I am a supply chain veteran, so I started my career working in a warehouse for Wang Computers, if any of you remember them.
They did not disrupt, right? They're an example of a dinosaur, right?
Absolutely, unfortunately. And another one that was disruptive, but then that kind of lost its way a little, is Dell. I worked for Dell during its very formative years. So I've had a lot of high-tech experience, and then I moved into consulting, management consulting for several years because I wanted to move industries, but I didn't have a degree. I was one of those that went straight from high school into a job. And in the US, it's extremely difficult to move between sectors unless you have that piece of paper. So I did my MBA at 33, went into management consulting for 3 years. And then 7 years ago, I went to work for the Bill Clinton Health Access Initiative. And I was very hesitant when a friend of mine asked me originally if I would be interested in working for not-for-profit. And my immediate thoughts were the UN agencies, you know, WHO, and how bureaucratic they are and how slow-moving. And coming from the high-tech industry to that type of environment, I didn't think I would assimilate, or that it would be something that I would work in. But in talking with the Clinton Foundation during the recruitment process, what was really interesting for me is the business principles that they were bringing to the sector. And this was very new and very refreshing, and their focus was very much on markets and shaping markets. And at the time, the HIV epidemic in Africa was totally out of control, especially in South Africa. And one of the reasons for it, while there was an awareness issue, one of the bigger reasons was actually the cost of the medicines. And there was a dilemma. The governments didn't have the money to buy the commodities, to buy the ARVs. They were also very expensive, and even if they had the money, they wouldn't be able to buy a lot of them. The manufacturers were actually willing to produce them to support the third world countries, but they didn't know what the demand was. They had no idea. South Africa could order, you know, 100,000 today. Malawi might order 10,000 tomorrow. You mightn't see another order for another 6 or 12 months. And there was no visibility. There was no conversations about it. So the Clinton Foundation actually stepped in and played that facilitation role and shaped the markets. And that has become a very big thing in global health. And so this is where working with the different governments to help them to forecast what the demand would be, not just for 12 months, but for a 5-year period. And then going to the manufacturers and helping the manufacturers to understand what the demand is, in what countries, and look at reducing the prices such that they were more affordable for governments to buy them. They also helped in bringing donor agencies like the US PEPFAR program, like the Global Fund in Europe, and many other international donors. They brought money to the table, and they were willing to actually pay for the medicine. So that role that the foundation played was really interesting to me because, quite frankly, the high-tech industry had got a bit boring at the time, even though that's changed now. And since then, I've been involved in supply chain and public health in Africa mostly for the last 7 years, and have absolutely loved how these principles that have come from the commercial markets are actually being applied in a very different way and in a very global way within the different countries, and the fact that people's lives are being significantly impacted by that.
Well, it's wonderful work. But, as I talk to manufacturers, they don't really know how to support a nonprofit. I was talking to a manufacturer the other day who had designed a giving supply chain, and, it's hard to know how to dance in this nonprofit world. What advice do you have for people?
So the other principle actually that the Clinton Foundation had, and later as I worked with the Bill Gates Foundation, was that there's more to this space than CSR and donations. Because if you actually can't make something commercially viable, then it's actually not going to be sustainable. Now, that's not to say that there isn't room for CSR. There absolutely is, and we've seen recently where the top 6 pharma companies have actually made significant donation of drugs for neglected tropical diseases, which are actually a very small number of patients across the world, but it's very expensive to treat people. And so there is opportunities like that where they're once-off, it's very focused on addressing a specific issue, and the power of the London Declaration, as it's called, can have a significant impact. But there's different ways that we find that manufacturers want to get involved. And there's different challenges that we see. The way companies want to engage, first of all, is commercially, and they always have to balance the commercial value of business in Africa, especially in healthcare, versus in the US or Europe, where the cost of drugs are much, much higher in the US and Europe, and the predictability of how you get paid and all of that is much higher. So that's the first thing. They want commercial markets, and so how can the donor organizations and how can the governments reduce the risk and also provide this opportunity for commercial viability down the line? The second way that manufacturers want to get involved is they actually want to have more dialogue. They actually want to be part. They want to work in collaboration, so that if they can understand what's coming up or what the trends are, then they can react to that, as opposed to, they can be proactive about it as opposed to being reactive. And that becomes difficult because there's a potential conflict of interest. And sometimes it's not the actual conflict of interest, but it's the perceived conflict of interest. So to get around that, there's these opportunities to try and have the discussions in groups as opposed to have the discussions between Pfizer and the government of South Africa. Okay. And so then trying to find the organizations that can kind of facilitate those discussions. And that's where, again, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation do a phenomenal job. And like they did with the London Declaration, there was this ability to find these opportunities for these organizations to have the dialogue, to understand what the problems are on the ground, to understand what the strategy is for the next 4 or 5 years, and understand the role that they can play. Then a lot of manufacturing companies are actually wanting to get involved with their employees. So they actually want to really do good, and they do want to give back. And there's a couple of ways they can do that. Through their employees, they can allow their employees to go work in Africa, 1 or 2 countries for 6 months and provide support. So you have the Pfizer Fellow program, to where they will have their different people across the year that will go work for 6 months in Tanzania with Save the Children, or go work in South Africa with somebody else. You also have programs where they can just go volunteer and build a house or whatever, so the traditional ones. But more and more the companies are actually, and on the sustainability side of it as well, there's more interest as well too, in terms of, climate change and all of that. But what we're starting to see more and more now is that you'll start to see joint programs that have, they call it social innovation. And so it's a CSR program, but there's actually a benefit back to the company. And there's an overall business case for doing it, which makes it much easier for the organization internally to get support for it from the executive management, but also gives that satisfaction to the employees and to the management, and gets the local organizations involved as well. So you see this quite a bit with Coca-Cola, and they do that with their local bottling operations, and you see this with Hewlett-Packard, who have been working with the Kenyan Ministry of Health and the Clinton Foundation, and are also doing some work in Nigeria with GSK and that. So it's changing a little bit, and what is making that change is actually the companies are coming forward and saying that we actually want to help, we want to do it in a constructive way, and we want to do it in a more sustainable way. It's not about writing a check anymore. So there's some of the examples.
So our two economists talked about two pictures of the world, and as I was looking at it, it had a lot of impact for Africa. You know, Dr. Gimwat's view of 2040, where we have China with really the red area on a lot of Africa, and then the discussion this morning around spikes and cities. What's your view of 2025 and what Africa looks like after hearing these professors talk?
Yeah, so both of those talks were very relevant for Africa. So first of all, I guess I would say, and I do this all the time, so Africa is like, it's not a country, it's a continent. It's got like 54 sovereign countries and so many territories and that. So when you talk about Africa, it's progressing at different, the problems it has it can be pretty different depending on what you're looking at. And a lot of people would say that really it's sub-Saharan Africa. You kind of need to take North Africa out of it, and you almost need to take South Africa out of it, because they're almost, I mean, they're not really Africa. In fact, you know, and Roddy, if he's here somewhere, can probably testify to this. I worked in South Africa for 3 years, and I ran a 3PL company there and responsible for the rest of Africa. And I would take my employees from South Africa up to Kenya to work with the teams up there and work in Nigeria. And they would say, oh, we're going to Africa. And I'm like, okay, hang on a second here. You're in Africa. South Africa is actually part of Africa. But the point I'm trying to make is that it's a collection of 54 sovereign countries. There are regional blocks, but the regional blocks have not been very strong. And this is one of the things I do see in 2025 for Africa, is that it will be more regional blocks. So you won't be talking about Africa, you will be talking about the East Africa, you will be talking about SADC, the Southern Africa, you will be talking about West Africa and Central Africa. So it will become more granular. You will also be talking about markets like Nigeria, Kenya, South Africa. So you will actually start to talk more about specific countries as well. There are going to be countries that are going to be left behind and that are going to be still dependent on aid, and there are going to be countries like Malawi. It's landlocked, it's got very poor governance, very poor government ruling. Zimbabwe may or may not, it kind of depends on what's going to happen with Mugabe and who's going to come after him. So you're going to see different tiers in terms of how the continent is progressing. The one thing I would have picked up from this morning's talk is that from a knowledge economy and the creativity, I think there's two things that drive creativity, are the two major things that drive creativity in my mind. One is the freedom to be creative. And I think we found in Ireland, in the schooling system we have, it doesn't encourage creativity and it doesn't encourage entrepreneurship, and that's actually started to change. And the other thing is adversity. You know, you have to be creative, you have to be entrepreneurial, and this is what we see in Africa. So we see a lot of people, we see a lot of entrepreneurship because people have to be creative around how they're going to address the challenges that they're seeing on a daily basis. And the one thing I get excited about in Africa is that there is more urbanization happening, so you are getting more of a collective, and you are seeing a lot of creativity. And through the work that we're doing, we're actually trying to encourage governments and donors and like the World Bank and all of that to actually support entrepreneurship and small to medium businesses, because we do think that's the future there. But we do think that there's very little legacy in Africa, especially when it comes to technology. And we do feel that they're probably going to leapfrog in terms of technology, and when it comes to supply chain, I think that we will see a lot more innovation in the supply chain adapted very quickly in Africa going forward. The other part to that is the infrastructure investment that is being made, and that's something that I feel wasn't really highlighted as much in the first discussion. There is huge investments going in, billions of dollars of investment going into port infrastructure in Kenya, in Tanzania, in Mozambique, in Namibia, and up into Lagos and in DRC or in the Congo as well. So there's significant investments going into port infrastructure. You would look at Ethiopian Airlines. They are one of the fastest growing airlines, and they've got probably the newest fleet of most international airlines. You also have Kenyan Airlines, South African Airlines. The one thing that Africa is struggling with at the moment is intra-trade. So there's very little intra-trade, but there's a huge focus on doing that, and this is where these regional blocks are actually going to come in. And the last thing I would say is that, so Africa is the second largest continent and the second most populous continent in the world. It's also got like a very, very young population, and it's got a very large population. It's at 1 billion, the population of Africa is at 1 billion at the moment. Nigeria is at 173 million. And they predict that by 2100, Nigeria itself will have 1 billion people. And Nigeria is half the size of Texas. So you're seeing a lot of growth, you're seeing a lot of investment, you're seeing a lot of creativity, you're not seeing a lot of legacy, and there is a lot of problems in terms of conflict, but quite frankly, when we look at what's going on around the world, it's not only Africa. And there's actually a huge diaspora and a lot of migration shift that we see will most likely come back into Africa as well.
But why the ports? I mean, the United States is not investing in the ports to the degree of Africa. I mean, I saw the opening of the Suez Canal, and why the ports? What's driving that?
The Chinese, quite frankly. And there is a lot of trade that is going between India for pharmaceuticals and from China for consumer goods. So the Chinese have a huge presence in Africa. If you go into any major city and you ask if there's a Chinese embassy, if there is one there, it's typically very big, and typically the roads are very good, and the investment in the country has been mostly done by the Chinese. So the Chinese are very aggressive. It's very easy for them to get agreement with the governments, whereas when the US puts investment in or Europe puts investment in, there's strings attached. You have to go through all of these, risk and governance, and it takes years, whereas the Chinese will go in, get an agreement, and put something up very, very quickly. So because of the increase in trade that's coming across the Silk Road, I mean, I was delighted to see that yesterday because we talk a lot about it. And that whole logistics corridor between Southeast Asia and the east of Africa is increasing dramatically. And so they see it, and they see the need to actually improve the ports. Now, to be fair, we're starting from a very low base because the port infrastructure is not very good. So to increase the trade into Africa and to be able to support it, the ports are huge, and fiber optics, there's massive investment in the fiber optics all around Africa and linking it back into the internal countries as well too.
I was in Nigeria and Kenya and was amazed at the use of mobile devices.
Oh, everywhere.
And mobile payment. Can you talk a little bit about mobile everywhere in Africa?
Yeah, and this is the thing I get excited about again. So that's a perfect example of, two perfect examples of where Africa is leapfrogging. So forget a landline, you're just not going to see them there. And typically, you will actually find that people have 2 phones, if not 3 phones. Now, they're not all smartphones, but I guarantee you there is very, very few places that you will go to in Africa to where people don't have access to a phone. And typically what we will see, especially in the work that we do, because public health has to basically support everybody in the country, so you are supporting every single part of the country, no matter how remote or rural it is. And I don't think there's any place that I have visited, and I have gone to quite a lot of these areas, that the people that I'm talking to at these health facilities or in the communities don't have access to a phone. So that is only going to get, better, and we're actually going to see the adoption of the broadband. So broadband is actually something that is one of their big initiatives at the moment. People use mobile phones for everything, and the mobile payments, the M-Pesa, is something that has been revolutionary. It's now been in Africa for about 6 or 7 years, and for those of you that don't know what that is, basically in Kenya, there was about 75% of the population could not open bank accounts. They would not qualify to open a bank account. And so Safaricom, which is part of Vodacom, I believe, they actually set up a transfer system through the phones to where you make minute payments. So you may need to, I might be in the city and I'm sending back money to my parents, and it might be $1, or if I want to pay my bills, I can pay with M-Pesa. And so the idea is all about very small transaction value amounts, but very high transaction volume. And so now the M-Pesa system in Kenya actually transfers more money than the top 5 banks put together. And the M-Pesa has also, the cash transfers through mobile has now been adopted in many other countries. So when you take innovation like that, I mean, that's how quickly it can be adapted. Well, 1, created, 2, adapted, and 3, scaled across the continent.
So a disruptive business model, like
Absolutely.
we were talking about yesterday.
Yeah.
What questions do you have on Africa, nonprofits, pharmaceuticals for Maeve? Questions? Roving mics?
So just Roddy Martin from Accenture to add to Maeve's story. A very interesting company in Boston called Jaina. And Jaina has syndicated cell phones. And what happens is if you're buying your little sachet of Unilever soap powder, there's a code on it. And when you key in your code, Unilever pays part of your cell phone bill. So when you think about that as disruption, they're doing market surveys of clothing all via cell phones. And Maeve has been talking to the Jaina organization.
Yep, absolutely. Okay, questions for Maeve? Yep, question up here? Yeah, we'll get the mic. Yep.
Suresh Acharya from JDA. The question that I wanted to ask you was kind of a confluence of 2 of the topics that you mentioned. What do you view in 2025 as China's role in potentially making Africa more stable?
In making Africa more stable.
Or do you think it'll be less stable?
Exactly.
Yeah, I mean, I actually do think it'll be more stable, but I think, again, you have to go country by country. I mean, North Africa was quite stable for a while, and now it's just kind of all over the place. I'm not sure. So it's been interesting in the last couple of years. Africa has had a very deliberate, in fact, it's not for a couple of years, it's probably for about the last decade. Africa has had this China-Africa conference that they have every year, and they actually do quite a lot at a political level. And so China actually does have influence in terms of, in several of the countries, not all of them, but in many of the countries, in terms of investments that are being made and basically influencing the politics there. But you see some countries in Africa that are actually shunning it because what's happening is China is actually taking more out of the country than they're actually giving back to the country. So there's a bit of a shift in terms of the relationships at the moment because I think many countries are feeling that they're actually not getting, like their people are not being trained because the workforce is actually coming in from China. Any of the money that's being made into resources is not coming back into the community, so it's going back. So in one way, there is an opportunity to use China and their relationships with the governments to get stability in some of these countries. But there is also, but again, it's country by country. So I don't think that China's strategy is, personally, I don't think China's strategy is going to be to stabilize Africa, because they can work in Angola, they can work in Sudan. They don't need a stable environment to work in it, because literally they will put people in, they will put infrastructure in, but they will take what they need out of it, and they can work in that environment. But I think what will provide more stability in Africa is that the African Union is getting stronger as a unit, and they're trying to shun approaches that come across as the outsiders telling them what to do and how to do it. And an example of that is in Kenya, where you have the president of Kenya that's being brought up in the ICC courts. And basically, they have got the support of several countries in Africa, as well as the African Union, that have basically told the EU, or told the ICC court, sorry, screw you, it's not relevant for us. And we look after our own problems internally. So I think in terms of stabilization in Africa, it's actually going to be more coming from the African Union.
Great question, though. It's amazing to see the influence. One more question, and we're going to shift gears. Okay, Eric, we're going to bring the mic. Raise your hand so Heather can see you.
Eric Blackburn, NeoGrid. I've been to Africa twice in the last 2 years, many of the countries you've mentioned, and seen that firsthand. Semis waiting on a week to cross out of Zimbabwe into Botswana. Do you see the U.S. policy changing given what China is doing?
So I'm most familiar with the U.S. policies through the health programs, and I will say that I just think that what the U.S. has been doing in terms of investment and the approaches around supply chain in Africa have been far ahead of what other organizations and agencies are doing. So to me, any change in terms of how people are thinking about supply chain, and especially supply chain for health, has been pushed by what USAID is invested in. And just to give you a number, they have got a contract, an award that they're issuing now, which is $10 billion over the next 8 years to address supply chain and to buy commodities in Africa. What's been interesting in how they have been changing their approach, they've gone from a response to the HIV epidemic as an emergency response. They're now moving more into how to make it a more sustainable model, and actually adding like essential medicines and everything into it, so that you're actually taking more of a systematic approach. But in terms of their policy change, they're actually trying to move out of aid and into trade, because they believe that for these systems to be sustainable at the end of the day, there has to be a commercial viability, and there actually has to be trade. So you will end up with commercially viable markets, and you will end up with a public good. But today, everything is being treated as a public good, and you're not actually allowing these markets to kind of flourish. So their policy move towards trade, not aid, means that they will now support capital investment in private sector companies and in logistics markets. They will provide support for human resources, which is the skills shortage in Africa is ridiculous. There's tons of people, but they don't have the right skills and expertise. So I actually think it will help move the supply chain agenda along quite a bit. The only thing for the health program support is that they will be reducing the number of countries that they provide that to. So then it's up to the international community to see how that can actually get scaled across the regions.
All righty. Aid versus trade, the evolution of Africa. Any last minute advice for the group?
I would say don't be afraid of Africa. I think a lot of people, and especially for global organizations, I think a lot of people kind of think about, you know, their US markets and maybe think about European markets. I think that there is a lot of opportunities in Africa. It doesn't mean to say that you have to jump on it right now, but I think, you know, even over the next day or two, even spending time with Roddy or with Jake, or even myself, just to talk about it, there is a huge opportunity. I see many companies that are trying to sell their solutions into organizations that have a lot of legacy systems, and it's difficult to kind of get the buy-in. In Africa, you're almost starting on a green field, and so you have huge opportunities there, so don't underestimate it, and people are brilliant.
And don't be afraid.
And
Thank
don't
you
be
so
afraid.
much. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Laura.
Let's give her a hand.